Hi, everyone. If you can hear me, please write a comment so that I can make sure that we're all here. Otherwise, we'll get started in about a minute or so. So we're just going to give it another 30 seconds or so to make sure that everyone is here that wanted to be here, and then we'll get started. But if at any point you can't hear me or I start buffering or something, just let me know in the comments. All right, so I've given folks a full minute to log in and be here. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Julie Lalonde, and I'm an educator who spent the last 15 years fighting to end violence against women in Canada, and who also comes at this work from personal experience. So just a few notes off the top. Like I said, if at any point you can't hear me or the video starts getting wonky or something, just put it in the comments. I'm moderating all the comments so I can see everything that you type. So just feel free to let me know. Obviously, we're talking about something that's heavy. You presumably came here knowing that, but just a reminder that sometimes we think we've dealt with our stuff and sometimes we feel like we're in a good place and then something comes at us and it's not great. So if at any point you need to bounce, go for it. If you need to just, peace out for a bit, this will be recorded so you can watch it from beginning to end at any point later on. It'll be saved on the Neighbors, Friends, and Family's site. So feel free to come back at a later point if you are in a better place and want to watch it again. Also, as I said, there's a chat box, so feel free to ask any questions throughout. I will leave a little bit of time at the end as well if you have any questions that weren't answered. And also just a note on language. So I'm known for being someone who swears a lot, but that's not what I mean in this case. I'm talking about criminal harassment and violence against women, and I'm going to be using the terms survivor and victim for a couple of reasons. One of which is we don't all survive, and our stories are still important and should still be talked about. So that's why I find the term victim helpful in those cases. But also, I think we need to challenge the connotation of the term victim and the idea that it means that you are helpless, that you are looking for empathy. Like, it's a weird kind of thing that has actually been proven to be that the term victim was co-opted by right-wing conservative groups to sort of drill in this idea that to be a victim is to be whiny and weak and helpless and just looking for attention. And I think we really need to challenge that idea and instead look at why is it that conservative folks feel that they're victims of freedom of speech and they're victims of political correctness, but when we're actual victims of crime, we don't have the right to call ourselves a victim. Personally, when I talk about my own experience, I use the term victim and survivor, but I do use the term victim a lot because I was the victim of a crime. And I think we need to really start talking about the ways in which violence against women is seen as almost like a rite of passage, instead of recognizing that many of us are victims of crime. And I was a victim of a crime. So I have been doing work on violence against women for the past 15 years. I'm very privileged in many ways. I have a national platform to talk about these issues. I've been in the media for years and years. I had a high-profile experience of being sexually harassed at the Royal Military College, and I'm very privileged. I come from a working-class family, but I'm the first person in my family to access post-secondary education, and I have a lot of opportunities to talk about violence against women, but I couldn't talk about what I was going through. So when I was in high school, I had a boyfriend who was incredible, and then I had this best friend who I thought was also really great. And at the end of high school, I broke up with my boyfriend. I wanted to move to Ottawa, go to university, be single, live my life. And this BFF of mine kind of swept in and said, I've been in love with you for years and years. I think we really need to be together. I think you need to see that I'm the one for you. And I really kind of got guilt tripped or worn down into being like, okay, I guess, even though I really wanted to be alone. So we dated over the summer. I was hoping that it would just be really casual and that I could move to Ottawa and be alone. And he, once again, really pressured me into saying, you know, I can't live without you. So I moved to Ottawa. He eventually showed up on my doorstep and said, I live here now because I can't live without you. And that began about 2 years of really, really, really awfulness. It took me 2 tries, but I eventually left him. And everything awful that he had done basically got cranked up to 11. He stalked me incessantly for over a decade. Everything from leaving notes on my car, leaving notes at my work. He would send me flowers. He would show up at my doorstep. He hacked into anything I could possibly have online, including my bank accounts. He tried to take down my various social media accounts. He would write nasty things about me online. He would follow me physically. I moved several times. He would find out where I lived. Then I'd have to move again. At one point, he actually moved into the apartment behind my house so that he could watch me at all times. It sort of waxed and waned over the last probably 4 years of it. But still, he always kept tabs on me. He always found ways to get in touch with me to let me know that he was watching me. And as someone who had a high profile, it was easier for him to find me because I would be on the news, and then he would know, like, oh, here's another excuse for me to contact her, or here's a story about her, so I'm going to write something in the comment section. And this went on for over a decade. And then about close to 3 years ago now, he died suddenly in an accident, and it was over. And I came out about my story. It really was sort of this coming out, and a huge part of the reaction I got was, I've seen you on the news sticking it to the military, who are people who are trained to kill people and keep secrets, and you did that without any problem, but you couldn't talk about what you were going through. And I think that's the first part that's really, really important for folks to understand, is that it was literally my job to speak truth to power on violence against women, and I couldn't talk about what I was going through because it wasn't safe. And so I'm going to emphasize several times over that you don't know who is being affected by this. You really don't know. And so it's important for us to talk about it as much as possible. So stalking in Canada is actually called criminal harassment. But of course, people can use whatever term they feel comfortable with. I always just echo back to people the term that they're most comfortable with, but I refer to my experience as stalking, and most people do. But what does it actually mean? Well, it's only been a labeled criminal offense in Canada since the early 90s. And it's defined, and I'm going to read it for you straight out of the criminal code. Criminal harassment. So what is criminal harassment? No person shall, without lawful authority and knowing that another person is harassed, or recklessly as to whether the other person is harassed, engage in conduct referred to in subsection 2 that causes that other person reasonably, in all of the circumstances, to fear for their safety or the safety of anyone known to them. So section 2, what does that mean? The conduct mentioned in section 1 consists of repeatedly following from place to place the other person or anyone known to them, repeatedly communicating with, either directly or indirectly, the other person or anyone known to them, besetting or watching the dwelling house or place where the other person or anyone known to them resides, works, carries on business, or happens to be, or engaging in threatening conduct directed at the other person or any member of their family. So how prevalent is criminal harassment? About 500,000 women self-reported being victims of stalking in 2009. That's a StatsCan survey. And criminal harassment is prevalent, and it's gendered. So women make up 76% of victims, and 58% of us are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. And that's also a 2011 StatsCan survey stat. About 75% of women who are stalked by an estranged spouse or partner, so people like me, are physically or sexually assaulted by the same person. That is absolutely my experience. I mean, this wasn't just someone who was watching me. This is someone who broke into my apartment, who sexually assaulted me, who threatened to hurt himself or to hurt me, to hurt my family. He threatened property damage to my car. So it's not just, hey, I'm watching you. It's like, I'm also physically harming you. So it's important for us to name the fact that stalking is gendered. Yes, anybody can be stalked. Absolutely, men absolutely can be stalked. But Stats Can data, this is taken directly from Justice Canada, 8 out of 10 victims of stalking are women, 8 out of 10, and 9 out of 10 stalkers are men. So even when men are being stalked, the vast majority of the time they're being stalked by another man. So I have a question for you, and I'm just going to pose it, and if folks want to interact in the chat, cool. I know some people are watching it as a group, and some people just want to watch and take part, so I'll ask you the question, give you some time, see if anyone responds, and then we'll launch into it. But my question is really like, why don't we talk about this? Why do you think that we don't talk about this? Particularly in this country, since 2014, in the sort of post-Ghomeshi world, we have things like hashtag been raped never reported, hashtag why I stayed, hashtag Me Too. I mean, the Me Too movement is a global movement on sexual violence, sexual harassment, violence against women, and violence against men. Why has stalking failed to be a part of that conversation? Do you have any thoughts or feelings on that? Unsurprisingly, I have thoughts and feelings also. But if anyone has any sort of thoughts, so fear is a big one. So one of the comments is fear is a big one, judgment for reporting. So yeah, if I come forward and talk about this, people are going to judge me, and I'm afraid it's going to make it worse. So fear of escalation is a big one for sure. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Any other thoughts? So if you're doing this later on as a group and you want to chat, this is a good time to pause, have the chat, and then we'll come back and keep the conversation going. So I have, Barbara said, I think survivors, women feel that they may have done something to encourage the behavior. That's a huge one. The amount of times people would say to me, you've let him on, you need to cut off contact with him completely, not understanding the cycle of abuse, not understanding how I might need to be in contact with that person, how keeping tabs on him made me safer because I knew where he was. And then even when I do cut off contact, there was still this assumption that I broke his heart, so he has the right to pine for me. All that kind of gross stuff came up for sure. So Barbara, you're absolutely correct. Kierlyn, I feel like sometimes stalking sneaks up on you, starting as normal things the guy did, and by the time it's a problem, it feels like you can't say anything if you put up with it or didn't mind the initial things. Huge. That's another big one, is it's like a boiling frog situation where it's not like, all of a sudden one day this person is doing something, much like the nature of intimate partner violence in general, is it kind of sneaks up on you where one day you realize, like, how the hell did I get here? Has it always been this bad? And then oftentimes it's other people that have to tell you, like, this is really messed up, for you to actually see it for what it is because it's so normalized to you. There's so I have two sort of big theories on why we're not having a conversation about stalking in the same way. One of them echoes what you folks have said, which is talking about stalking makes it worse. By definition, unless your abuser is in jail or dead, talking about stalking makes it worse. The nature of criminal harassment is that person is dying for your attention. They are dying, pardon me, for you to acknowledge them. And so for you to acknowledge that it's happening to you is kind of a flag to that person of like, ooh, they are thinking about me. Ooh, I am getting to them. Ooh, this is effective. So I'm just going to like crank it up. Talking about stalking makes it worse. And it's hard because we're in this context right now where we're having all of these conversations about violence and we're talking about it and we're asking people to break the silence. And it's so important. But we're not going to have a Me Too movement around stalking. By definition, we're not going to have a Me Too movement about stalking. And so it's up to those of us who are in a position to talk about it to really have that conversation, because for the vast majority of victims and survivors, it is not safe for them to talk about. The second piece is a systemic one. So in Canada, our violence against women organizations are funded in sort of two streams. So on the one hand, you have intimate partner violence through shelter movements, and then on the other, you have rape crisis centers and sexual assault support. And they're kind of siloed. And the nature of criminal harassment kind of falls between the two. So as we said, the vast majority of folks are stalked by someone that they know. So that would be kind of the intimate partner violence shelter movement piece. But for women in particular who are being stalked by men, criminal harassment feels like the threat of rape hanging over your head. It's a part of rape culture. Rape culture is surveillance. It's women constantly being on the lookout. It's feeling like you're being leered at, feel like you're being watched, feel like all that sort of paranoia that's justified. That's part of rape culture, but it feels like sexual violence. And so criminal harassment kind of falls between the shelter movement's work and rape crisis center work. And as a result, it doesn't really get addressed in a public forum. Now, I want to say there are lots of incredible organizations who do this work, but they're not often explicit about it. And Canada does not have a single organization whose sole mandate is to do work on stalking. Not a single one, which is bananas to me and something I'm hoping to change. But you don't even have, like, just for this presentation, just for kicks, I Googled criminal harassment Canada. It's like nothing. There's like crickets. There's some criminal code stuff on Justice Canada's website. There's some resources for cops, but there's like nobody whose job it is to do this work. So it's like, who's going to pick up the torch, right? Now, I have a question. My next question is, what do you think causes criminal harassment? What are some of the root cause issues that have made this a problem? I'm losing my voice, apparently. So what do you think are some of the things that cause criminal harassment? While you folks sort of ponder and type up answers, I will say that in my experience, what I hear often, what I heard when it was happening, and certainly what I've heard since, even from youth, when I give presentations about my experience, is a lot of like, he was crazy. Like, he was straight up cray. So this was clearly a mental health issue. This is an issue of mental illness, and obsession is a mental... Sure. There are certainly, mental health can certainly be a part of this conversation, but I think it dominates the conversation in a way that it absolutely shouldn't. I have no idea whether or not my abuser had a mental health condition. Couldn't tell you. But, you know, in our current climate, we have to decide whether or not we think misogyny is a mental health issue, because that is often the root cause of what we're seeing. In my experience, there's a couple of factors at play. One is just straight up entitlement. I know it sounds like a second wave 1970s feminist conversation to have, but absolutely entitlement. If you are a man who is raised to feel as though you're entitled to women's time, you're entitled to women's attention, you're entitled to get her answer whenever you want one, you're entitled, you know, you're a 5 and you're entitled to date a 10, and if she's not a 10, you're entitled to tell her otherwise, you're entitled to women's bodies in public spaces, you're entitled to do whatever you want, then the second someone says no to you or rejects you or says they don't want any contact with you, they don't want to date you anymore, then it's like, whoa, no, I am entitled to what I want, and I'm going to respond to that with violence. So straight up male entitlement is a huge contributing factor to criminal harassment. Secondly, we have the fact that we do not, in our culture, we do not create spaces for men to be vulnerable in a healthy way. So in my case, my abuser used that to his advantage. He would stand outside my apartment building with a bouquet of flowers, sobbing, "Open the door, Julie, open the door. I miss you, I miss you, I miss you." And my neighbors would be like, "What a bitch. Why did you just let him in? Like, he's obviously, you know, sorry for whatever he did. He obviously loves her." He would woo my neighbors into letting him into the building, even though I had asked them not to. He, you know, whenever he was banned from coming to see me in different places, he would get other people to deliver packages on his behalf. I remember once my landlord like dropped off a box and was like, "Oh, this sweet young man came and dropped this off for me." So he really used the fact that he was vulnerable as bravery, and people saw it as brave that this young, straight white boy was crying and being open about how sad he was. People saw that as bravery. And really, if you think about it, if I, as a woman, had been crying outside the door of my ex-boyfriend's house years after he left me, people would have called the cops on me. They would have been like, I mean, there's an entire meme online about like the crazy girlfriend, right? Like, that's a narrative that we have that's extremely problematic, but it's telling that that's something that people would view as like, that's a flag, versus in my case where they were like, "Oh my God, he's so brave for like being publicly heartbroken." And the third one, that's a big one that Courtney in the comments has pointed out, is we romanticize shady stalking behavior, and we have proof of it. So Julia Lippman did some incredibly groundbreaking research that if you want to go and look up the citation, it's called "I Did It Because I Never Stopped Loving You: The Effects of Media Portrayals of Persistent Pursuit on Beliefs About Stalking." So she had a group of about 430 women, each watch one of 6 movies that had been edited down to about a half hour. So there were sort of different control groups. There was a romantic comedy where a man pursues a woman and it's depicted positively. So she used There's Something About Mary and the film Management. There was a movie where a man pursues a woman romantically and it's depicted as creepy as hell. So they used Sleeping with the Enemy, which trigger warning on that one, or Enough, the J-Lo movie. And then there was a third control group that just watched a nature documentary. They had the best gig. They got to watch March of the Penguins as the control group. So after the screening of each of the movies, the women took a survey ranking their agreement with several stalking myths, such as many alleged stalking victims are actually people who played hard to get and then changed their mind, or an individual who goes to the extremes of stalking must really feel passionately for their love interest. Those who had seen the scary stalking movie were less likely to believe the stalking myths. Women who had watched the rom-coms endorsed these myths more because of things like the music was romantic. It was framed as a grand gesture. Everything, like I said, the music, the actors, the lighting, like everything in the film sort of depicted as like, this is light and fluffy, versus films like Enough, where it was like dark music, the lighting was dark, it was sort of like this creepy vibe. But then women were like, no, J-Lo is not still in love with her ex-husband. He'd be terrifying. So what she was able to show is that the grand gesture of rom-coms, so for example, in There's Something About Mary, he straight up hires a private eye to track down his high school prom date so that he could tell her how much he loved her, because there's just something about Mary. When you just suck all that stuff in without any analysis, you are off. It's sort of framed as like true love. Like, look at this grand gesture that I made. Look at this big effort that I made. And Lippman says, and I quote, "Indeed, they may be seen as reflecting one of the greatest cultural myths of romantic love, that no matter how big the obstacle, love will conquer all." End quote. So I, like Courtney, am on Team Penguins, and I wish that all we had were sort of March of the Penguin type movies that were like light and fluffy. Both Julia Lippman and myself, whenever I talk about this, have gotten criticism for saying that we're like shitting on romantic comedies. We're not. If you watch films as escapism, into it. If it's like a form of fantasy for you to think that like you're going to stumble down the sidewalk and meet a beautiful architect and you're going to have a great life, like, get it. I'm not here to judge. The issue is I think we've gotten a bit better in sort of looking at how Disney films and princess narratives frame women up to sort of understand romantic in a really disturbing way. Like, Ariel literally gives up her voice for a man she's never talked to, like, creepy. But we actually have done very little to sort of talk about, okay, well, we transitioned from Disney films to rom-coms, and we're reinforcing these really problematic ideas of what romantic is and what romance looks like. And so it's not to say you can't watch rom-coms. I don't think that. Julia doesn't think that. But it's about the analysis. It's about the conversations. It's about the subtle undertones. And some further research that she wants to do, which I think would be really interesting, is looking at how do men respond to those kinds of films? How do men respond to, for me, the two big ones are like John Cusack with a boombox outside of that girl's door and say anything. Ducky driving by her house on his bike, to the dude from Love Actually who's like in love with his best friend's wife and like holds up a sign being like, "I'll always love you till you're a corpse." And she's like, "Oh, that's so beautiful." Like, it's weird and disturbing. But as a woman, I take in certain messages and she questions and I question, okay, well, what kind of message are we sending to men? So now I want to transition into the last half of this conversation and just sort of look at what this looks like on a practical level. So as an educator, I'm obsessed with the practicalities of pieces of conversation. I'm obsessed with, we can't just have this conversation at a theoretical level, but I think it's also important to have those kind of theoretical tools to be able to use to kind of unpack some of this stuff. So once again, her name is Julia Lippman, Lippman, and her research is really quite interesting. And if you have access to an academic journal, you can get the whole thing. Otherwise, I can put you in touch with her. But it's a really great way to sort of prove what we know to be true, which is oftentimes criminal harassment is framed as romance. And Megan just commented that that's such a good point. Girls and young women are constantly learning from movies, so it's important to look into the messages that they're sending. Absolutely. And for me, like I said, we're like all about unpacking Disney princesses, which I'm here for, but we haven't really transitioned to like, okay, what does it look like when you're like a teen or a young woman or even like a middle-aged woman and your escapism is like crushing some rom-coms, which I'm here for, but do you have the analysis and are we having a conversation about the problematic messaging? So, like I said, as an educator, I think it's really important that we have a practical conversation of what this kind of looks like and what it looks like to address this behavior. So, I want to talk about safety planning in particular. I want to talk to anyone watching this who is a victim or a survivor who's going through it, or who maybe is in a relationship where they fear that this is a reality that they might face. So, also, if you're a parent or an educator or a friend and you know that your friend is in a relationship that you're kind of worried about, here's some stuff to think about. So if you're dating someone and you're worried that leaving them might mean that you'll be stalked, here are some sort of signs that we know can lead to, or that are part of an abusive relationship, but they can also lead to the fact that when you leave, they're not going to take no for an answer. 1, persistent, constant, nonstop communication. So even when you're together, the expectation that you have to be, you can't leave that person on read and you got to respond right away. Controlling who you can talk to and when. Needing all of your passwords. So this idea that is unfortunately very common that I see a lot in my work, which is if you date someone and they don't give you access to their passwords, it's because they have something to hide. Hells no. Like, everyone is entitled to privacy. If you've been married for 40 years, you can still have a password on your laptop and your phone and your social media. That doesn't mean you have something to hide. It means you're entitled to privacy. Someone who's constantly finding ways to put you down or negging. So like, let's all thank pickup artists for developing that idea, which is basically where you put a woman down constantly in like little tiny shitty ways. And then every once in a while you kind of like throw her a bone and then she's supposed to be like, oh my God, he's so nice to me. And you're like, that's because we've lowered the bar to the freaking floor. Threatening self-harm if you leave or you don't do as they say. This is a common one. Unfortunately, I experienced it. I had the heartbreaking experience of working at an elementary school about 2 weeks ago where a young woman said that happened to her, that she was like in grade 6 and wanted to break up with this guy, and he said he was going to kill himself if she did. So that's a hugely common one. And then, of course, physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual, or economic abuse. If someone controls your money, if someone controls whether or not you're able to access your faith community, if someone is forcing you into a faith community, if someone makes you doubt your own perception of reality, which is what we call gaslighting, any of those things, those are huge. Not only they're abusive in and of themselves, not okay, but they're also red flags that just leaving that person might not be as cut and dry as you'd like. So if you know someone or you yourself are in a situation and you want to leave, I support you, but I also have some advice for you. First of all, always trust your gut and safety plan. So if you feel like leaving them is going to make things worse, then you're not wrong. You are the best expert on your own reality and you know that person better than anyone. If you have a friend that you trust really well, try role playing with them. It feels kind of dorky, but like role play with them and then get them to explore every possible outcome. So you break up with him and he's like weirdly chill with it. You break up with him and he gets violent. You break up with him and he starts coercing you into, no, I'll change, I'm good people, and kind of practice being assertive in standing your ground. Ask yourself some questions like, is it safer to dump them in public? Is it safer if I bring a friend with me? Is it safer if I do it in public and I have a friend maybe in the other room, or I have a friend like kind of down the hall so they're not necessarily right beside me, but if something goes down, they're there to help me? Is it safer if I do it over the phone, via text, via email, via FaceTime? I know in our culture, we like look down on people who break up with people over social media and it's considered cowardly. If you got to do what you got to do to be safe, like I'm here for it. If you got to straight up ghost them and that feels the safest, like do it. Another piece that's really important that thankfully did not happen to me, and it's just because technology did not exist at the time when I was dating him. But if you're dumping someone and they have access to your nudes, because you've sent them nudes throughout the course of your relationship with them, or just you just sent them nudes, whatever, you do you, don't judgment. just know that that is probably going to be used against you. Know two things. One, if you're under the age of 18, too often young women don't report that their nudes have been shared or will be shared because they're afraid that they themselves will be criminalized for creating child pornography. That's a result of terrible misinformation that was perpetuated by police. If you are under the age of 18 and your nudes are being shared without your consent and you're not calling the cops because you're afraid you're going to be charged with creating child pornography, don't be afraid. From a legal standpoint, you are the victim of a crime. You are not a criminal. So you can absolutely say what you need to say, but also know that it's, as of the last couple of years ago, as a result of Bill C-13, it's a crime in Canada to share someone's nudes without their permission, regardless of how old they are. So if you're 45 and some dude's sharing your nudes and you're like, well, it's not child pornography, it's still a crime. So know that. So things like revenge porn, which is a term that's gross, but where all of that stuff, like, it's a crime. It's a straight up crime. And it's not your shame to bear. Like, your naked body does not mean that you are, like, not worthy of love and you're not worthy of respect, or like you were asking for it. Like, in the same way that if you were sexually assaulted on the sidewalk, if someone shares your nudes without permission to try to blackmail you, they're a piece of shit and you're not a bad person and you are deserving of love and support like everybody else. So, you left somebody who was a creep, or maybe you rejected someone who was a creep that you never dated in the first place, and now you're being stalked. Here are some things that I learned that might be helpful for you. First of all, document. I cannot emphasize this enough. Every time he calls you, screen grab it. Every time you get a text, screen grab it. Every time they leave a note on your car, keep a copy. If you don't feel comfortable because you think that person has access to your technology, take a screen grab, send it to a friend, print it, like, kick it old school. I had photocopies of the threats that I received, and various friends held on to copies of them. Criminal harassment is illegal in Canada, but it's unfortunately very difficult to prove. So you need to be able to have as much evidence as possible. If something happened, if he came to approach you and there was someone else around, write down dates, times. Stephanie was there with me. It was like at the corner of this and this, and just keep a diary and a log of as much of it as you can. Lock down all of your social media as much as possible. I know it sucks. And I get that it's also really damaging to your career. When my career started sort of taking off a bit, I delayed by about a year, to my own detriment, creating my own website, creating my own social media, especially Twitter, and having a contact me page on my website, because it was like, I'm giving him access to another way of getting in touch with me. So, use your own judgment, use your own discretion. If you absolutely need to have a public Twitter account for work purposes, doesn't mean you're asking to be stalked, but just be mindful of sort of what information you post. So don't geotag your pictures, don't check in on social media, like whether it's like, whatever you're doing, to be like, oh, I'm here, so make sure that your GPS is deactivated from your phone, which sucks. I'm a grown woman who can't use Uber, I can't use Lyft, I can't get food delivered to my house. If I'm lost in another town, I have to just old school find my way around because I don't have GPS on my phone. If you have GPS on your phone, every time you take a photo, it's geotagged as to where it is. It sucks that you're being limited in what you're doing, but that's my sort of best advice. Once again, if you have the GPS on your phone and you're being stalked, you're not committing a crime. You're not asking to be harassed. You are you do you. If Uber is how you get around, you just keep getting around with Uber. These are just sort of tips that I found to be a little bit helpful. If you live together and you can't move, know that in at least 2 provinces in Ontario and in Alberta, your landlord must let you break your lease if you're fleeing violence. Now, I've heard that there's possibly in Nova Scotia, possibly in BC as well, that you can also break your lease if you're fleeing violence and your landlord can't criminalize you for that. So if you are able to move, if that's something that you're financially able to do, know that you don't have to worry about what's left of your lease. If you can't move because you can't afford it, or you're like, this is my house, screw him, I support that too. Change your locks. If you trust your landlord, if you trust your neighbors, warn them. I did at one point live in a building in which I had really solid neighbors who were like, this is what he looks like, do not let him in the building, he will try to sweet talk you, but he's a piece of shit, so do not let him in the building. But once again, if you can move, in Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And I've heard, as I said, some rumors that it's the case in Nova Scotia, but it might be really hard to do. But for sure, Ontario, Alberta, and BC, which Eva BC has just confirmed, you absolutely can break your lease and you can't be penalized for it. You have to, if your landlord pushes you on it, you have to print off this form and do this whole rigmarole. But I like to remind landlords that like people bail on their leases for really shitty, stupid reasons all the time. And you just let it go. So let people break their lease, because to quote one landlord that I was speaking to last year when this became law in Ontario was, as a landlord, I'd rather have someone bail on a lease than have a crime scene in one of my apartment buildings. And I was like, straight up. If you can afford to send your mail to a P.O. box, I know that feels really old school, but do it. It's about $150 a year. It's not cheap. I do it still, and I've been doing it for years. So it's not cheap. But it is a great way to ensure that your mail can't be intercepted, identity theft, any of that kind of stuff. They can have access to your bills. They can cut off your phone, like any of that. So if you can afford it to send your mail to a P.O. box, I recommend that. Set up a check-in system with your friends. Super important. So have them, especially when you feel like, okay, this is a very volatile time right now. I had a check-in system with my friends evening and night. So they would send me a text in the morning. 15 minutes went by and I didn't respond, they knew something was up. Then we would talk about, okay, what do you do if you think something is up? If I didn't respond to your text, what are we going to do next? And sort of talk through what makes you feel safe. Trust your gut. And I know that sounds like an inspirational meme that like someone posted on Instagram, but like the amount of times that my gut was telling me this is scary, this is messed up, and the people around me would just be like, what? Because they viewed every single thing he did in isolation. They didn't see the full picture. So if your gut is telling you this is getting more dangerous, if you've heard that he lost his job, if you've heard that, he's moved into your neighborhood, like if you are scared and you feel like things are escalating, you absolutely should trust your gut. Don't let people tell you otherwise. And that similarly, if you're not that worried, or you're kind of minimizing the behavior because that's a survival strategy, and I respect that, but your friends are saying like, Julie, like, this is really scary. Like, as an outsider, I'm really scared for you. Trust them. Your friends are only looking out for you. Your friends just want you to be safe. So if it's something like stay over at their house for a night or two just so that they can feel better and then you'll feel better, say, come stay at my house. Just come have sleep at my house for a couple days, just so that I'm not alone. Like, trust what you got to do. And lastly, but to me, the most important of all is like, find the people that will support you. The reason why I'm still here, the only reason why I'm still here, is because I've had the same best friend since I was 10 years old. And when I told her that I was thinking about leaving him, and this is like the time when I get sort of choked up because it's still the moment that literally saved my life, is I said, I think I'm going to leave him. Like, I have the courage today, and I think I'm going to do it. And she was like, okay. And if you don't, that's okay too. I'm still here for you. Yeah, and I guess it's super shocked when I think about it, because that saved my life. Because that time when I went home and I couldn't do it, and I tried to, and then he coerced me into staying, and I got so visibly anxious that I literally was throwing up profusely for hours on end. When I called her the next day and said I didn't do it, she was like, that's okay. I'm still here for you. You didn't disappoint me. You're doing the best you can, right? And everyone else told me I was a big disappointment, right? Because I was smart and I was feminist and I was studying women's studies and I was living with a guy who was abusive and I came from a home in which I was told, like, it's just so important that you drive home for your friends how much you care about them, and that you yourself don't feel ashamed about what you're going through. This is not about you. It's about him. And I was so worried that I was a burden on my friends that I wasn't as open with everybody about how bad it was, so that when he died and I started talking about it, people were like, what? Oh my God, I didn't know how bad it was. So then I felt like, oh, well, then I don't have the right to be upset that no one was there for me because I wasn't honest about how bad it was. And it just becomes this like nasty, vicious cycle. So one, find people that you trust, that have got your back, and real talk how awful it is. And this is my last piece that I want to end on. And then, of course, open it up if you have any questions, is how to be an ally. How to be an ally to someone who's being stalked. It's very easy to say that you'll be a friend, and I give all kinds of workshops where, whether we're talking sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, people are like, my girlfriends are ride or die. I would be there for them no matter what. This went on for over a decade. So like to be my friend and to be my support was to be my support for a long ass time. We're not just talking about like one day where I'm crying about a bad breakup. We're talking possibly months of having to be someone's support. So it's a lot of work, and a lot of people are not willing to put in that work, or they just don't know what to do. So here are my tips if you know someone who's being stalked. First of all, understand the cycle of abuse. People did not understand why it was really hard for me to cut off contact with him. They were just like, he's an abusive, rapist guy who made you feel like garbage when you are fire. Why are you still talking to him? What's wrong with you? You're smarter than this. Like, these are things that people said to me, thinking they were doing me a solid, thinking they were giving me kind of like the emotional slap across the face of like, snap out of it, woman, you're smarter than this. Meanwhile, it just made me feel dumb. It just made me feel like I was disappointing people. It made me feel like I was letting people down. And no one wants to feel stupid. No one wants to feel, and what you're doing, you think that you're like building that person up, but you're actually mimicking the voices that she's been having to listen to that have told her that she's dumb and a disappointment and not smart and not good enough. So don't be that person. It might be really hard for you to understand why she can't just like write him off as like, he's dead to me, but you weren't there during the honeymoon period when that person was lovely. So you were not ensnared in the brainwashing like they were, so respect that. 2, check in and validate. There's this sort of idea that I didn't talk about what I was going through when I was going through it because I just didn't want to talk about it, which is hilarious because if you know me, I'm chatty. I'm a talker. I just felt like I was burdening people. But anyone who asked me how I was doing got an honest answer from me. So check in, initiate those conversations. Say like, hey, just want to let you know, I know what's going on and it sucks. How you doing? If you need to talk about it, I'm here for you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm sorry this is still going on. Like, I got you. Like, initiate those conversations and check in about it. Respect confidentiality. This is huge. Not only is it rude to talk about someone's experience without their permission, it could put their life at risk. So do not talk about someone's experience unless you have explicit permission to do so. Otherwise, you are not only being a shitty friend, you might be endangering your friend. And then, of course, reiterating, trust your gut. If you feel like the situation is getting worse, make sure that you tell that to your friend. Be explicit. I see this. It's making me feel this. This is what I would like for us to do together. So, how you can be an ally to all survivors and victims, whether or not you know someone directly or not. I created a film. So the violence against women sector, the feminist movement, I feel really has been failing victims of stalking. It's like the one real talk thing that I will say, as much as I love this movement and have proudly been a part of it for a long time. We have thousands of resources on intimate partner violence and on sexual assault and rape culture and consent. And there is nothing on criminal harassment. So last summer, I really challenged my frustration and into creating a film. So I contacted this incredible artist. Her name is Ambivalently Yours. She's based out of Montreal. She's incredible. I highly recommend you check out her work. It's beautiful and powerful and super feminist and intersectional. And I contacted her and I said, do you make films? And she was like, kinda, I could. And I was like, I want to make a short film about my experience that has practical skills for survivors. And I asked her how much she needed, and then I went out and raised it. And the result is a 5-minute film called Outside of the Shadows, or All de la Noirceur en français, which is free and available on YouTube. So please share it, post it on your various social media accounts. You do not know who needs it. I am proof of that. I went to work every day as an advocate for victims and survivors of violence, and nobody knew what I was going through. And I was so desperate for people to talk about this, and they didn't. So you don't know who it's going to impact. So I recommend that you share the film. It sounds like a plug. I make no money off of it. I made no money making the film. I make no money in the creation of the film, or that's like, I put it up for free on YouTube because I wanted folks to see it. So once again, it's Outside of the Shadows. I've also created a website, outsideoftheshadows.ca, aldelanoisa.ca, which we're basically just treating as like a clearinghouse of any information about stalking. So you'll find the legal definition of stalking in Canada. I made poster versions of the film, so if you want to snag those, post them on your various accounts, let me know. If you want print copies, I can send you some. That's no problem. So really share the film. It's like a really easy way to just kind of like be like, hey, here's this film I thought was interesting. And then you're kind of signaling to anyone in your life that you can talk to them if they need to. 2, be explicit in your work. Whether your work is violence against women, whether your work is anti-poverty work, whether your work is anti-racism work, whatever it is, if you care about stalking, name it, be explicit about it, name it as part of the continuum of violence, name it as part of the work that you're doing, or that you recognize is on the continuum of violence and is on your radar. Choose your words. Call out people who talk about, oh, I was stalking them on social media. Oh my God, if one more person says that to me, I'm gonna like flip a table. Like when people talk about like stalking each other's Instagrams, were you actually stalking that person's Instagram, or were you just going through photos on their public feed that they were okay with you looking at? The way in which we talk about stalking in this sort of flippant way is similar to how we talk about like, oh, I just got raped by that team. It's not only like just like, ugh, tacky, but it's problematic, because then when I would talk about like, no, he's literally stalking my social media accounts, people were just like, oh, but I do that all the time to people I'm about to go on a date with. I'm like, we're not talking about the same things. Like, so be mindful of the language that you use. Safety plan with absolutely everybody who is leaving a relationship that had some element of violence. I don't care if she's a 15-year-old girl and they never lived together and they only ever held hands at school. She might still need safety planning to ensure that she's not being stalked by him. So make sure that that's a part of the conversation you have. Don't just tell women to leave men who are shitty. Talk about what could happen next. If you have young men in your life, you got a super important role to play. So real talk with them about entitlement. Real talk with them about how women don't owe you shit. They don't owe you a date. They don't owe you a call back. They don't owe you a text. If they say no, it's a no. No doesn't mean try harder. You are not owed that person because you were nice to them. Talk to them about the friend zone and how it does not exist. And it's literally just saying that girl was nice to you and she didn't have sex with you, so now she owes you something. And if not, she was using you the whole time. Which is, one, is extremely heteronormative. You're assuming that women are just sitting around waiting to date men. Not everyone dates men. And two, it's sad to think that women and men can't just be friends. And it's also, once again, speaks to entitlement, that this guy feels like, oh, I put all of these coins into the nice machine and sex didn't fall out, so now I'm pissed at you and I'm going to be violent in response. Teach young men and boys to actually be vulnerable in a healthy way so that we don't view their vulnerability as brave and courageous and then in turn enable all kinds of nasty, violent things to happen under the guise of romance. And lastly, use your privilege to talk about this. And I mean that for everybody. If you are not currently being stalked, if it is safe for you to talk about your experience, or if you're just somebody to whom it's never happened and you're not at risk of it, then you have a responsibility to talk about it. Because I cannot emphasize enough, we will not have a Me Too movement on stalking, because by definition, talking about it makes it worse and it literally endangers your life. So unless your stalker's in jail or he's dead, you can't talk about it. And so it's up to everybody else who knows about the issue, who has this analysis, who has these tools to put it out into the world and to make it known that this is something that we need to talk about and we need to address. My film is called Outside of the Shadows for a lot of reasons. And one of them is that like, this is a thing that happens all the time and we don't talk about it. But as someone who has talked about it, it is astounding the amount of people who have confided in me because I'm the only person that ever talked about it. And for years, I would literally just like give a stat about stalking in my workshops, never talk about my own experience, just kind of like put it in there of like, women under 25 live at risk of criminal harassment and sexual violence. And then that was it. And the amount of people who would message me afterwards or come up to me afterwards in person to say, thank you so much for saying that. I've never seen anyone talk about that before. And it was literally 2 seconds in a 2-hour workshop. Like, that's how important it is for people to name it. And as I said, use me as an example. I had every opportunity available in this country to talk about violence against women, and I couldn't talk about my experience, and people didn't know it was happening. So you really don't know who needs this message, and how important it is for you to be an ally to them. So first of all, coming to this, super important, and I'm super grateful. And I see in the comments some folks who are grateful themselves for having attended, and I think that's incredible. So thank you for that. And I'm just wondering if anyone, we have a few minutes left, if anyone has any further questions or comments that they'd like to make or things that they'd like me to address. I'll just give you a few minutes if you have any questions that you want to ask. Just a reminder again of a few things. So this video, as well as the other videos, so Matt Schaff talked about The Role of Men, which was great. Steph Guthrie talked about the film A Better Man, which is an incredible film where a man is taken responsibility and accountability, which I think is a really important conversation to have. Those are available also on the Neighbors, Friends, and Families Facebook page. This video will be as well. So I encourage you, like I said, to share the film. But if you also want to share the link to this, or you want to refer somebody here, please, it's here for you to be able to do that or to come back to. Kira, yeah. So Kira said a really important part of this conversation is never tease men and boys for getting rejected. Model that it's a normal part of life. Super important. Yes, absolutely. Super important to talk about. Like, women get rejected all the time. Men get rejected all the time. I've been rejected a bunch. And so if you work with men or you have any kind of influence over men, talk about your experiences of rejection. Like, talk about, I had a bruised ego and a broken heart. And I was pretty bummed out about it. But I moved on with my life. And I realized that it's because I came on too strong. So next time I tried, whatever, talk about your experiences of rejection. Talk about how, to paraphrase Dita Von Teese, you can be the juiciest, plumpest peach on the tree, but not everybody likes peaches. So you're not everybody's type. Not everybody's going to like you the way that you like them back. And that's not just unique to men. Women get rejected all the time. I've been rejected tons of times. So and I'm okay. So yeah, absolutely role model positive ways in which to be rejected. Just want to give a shout out to Rose, who's sort of talking about, the complexity and the reality in the comments of stalking, and how, yeah, it's not always safe to talk about it, but that, they're putting in the work to make sure that people know that there's legislative change. I'm absolutely here for that as well. I mean, we could have a whole conversation about the failures of the legal system. It's a question I get a lot. I did call police. They did believe me for a while, but they didn't do anything about it. And so I think we need to complicate conversations around believing survivors, because I was believed, I had documented evidence, and they still took months to get back to me. And by the time they did, I was the shell of a human being and not interested in pursuing anything. And as a result, I was told that it was my fault because I could stop this person and I wasn't. So we absolutely need to see some legislative changes in this country. The peace bond process is broken and it endangered my life. So yeah, I encourage you that if you want to take it a step further beyond the tips that I gave about allyship, let's have a conversation about how we're going to change some laws in this country. And we're going to train cops to give a damn about criminal harassment. And we're going to have conversations about peace bonds, and we're going to have conversations around education in schools, and consent. If you're having a conversation about consent, part of that is handling rejection, right? So, yeah, Rose is saying, there's also conversations around legalizing mace. I'm not a part of that conversation. I don't think that's a really great idea personally, but I am part of having conversations around what do we do, how do we keep women safe? And for me, this is why I believe in bystander intervention, because most of us are not calling the cops, and even when we do, we're not getting the answers we're looking for. But we do lean on our communities, and our communities are aware of what's going on, and what are they going to do to step up? And that's really my question to you. So I'm going to end here. Thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. Once again, outsideoftheshadows.ca is the website for the film and the project that I started, that I'm kind of running off the side of my desk, but I hope might be an organization one day that actually works on this issue. You can find me at yellowmotto.com or Julie S. Lalonde on Twitter if you want to keep this conversation going. If you're just looking to reach out to someone who's been there and you've never had that moment, if you've ever had, the first time I ever sat in another room with another survivor of stalking, it was a life-changing experience, because I was like, I've never, ever had this privilege. It's a privilege to see my experience reflected. So if you need that person, I can be that person for you. Please get in touch. A big thank you to neighbors, friends, and families for reaching out to me. I think it's very telling that stalking was on their radar, and I think that's so incredible. And one of their talks coming up is Jackson Cats, the wonderful Jackson Cats. So stay tuned for that as well. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and that you find a way to sort of decompress after this heavy chat in whatever way feels good for you. Thanks so much.